a child invisible to the eyes of the world, an ordinary woman with a past marked by loss. When everything seemed defined, an unlikely gesture changes the course of 3 lives forever. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Beacon Hill mansion, casting geometric patterns across the marble floor. Richard Garrett stood in his office, overlooking the manicured gardens that surrounded his property, one of the most prestigious addresses in Boston. His reflection in the glass showed a man who appeared younger than his 42 years, yet his eyes told a different story. They carried the weight of someone who had learned that money could buy almost everything, except what mattered most. The house was always silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence that comes from contentment, but the heavy, deliberate quiet of a place where joy had been carefully packed away. Since losing his wife 3 years ago, Richard had transformed their home into something resembling a high-end medical facility more than a family residence. The warm colors Amanda had chosen were replaced with neutral tones. The laughter that once echoed through the halls had been replaced by the soft footsteps of medical staff and the occasional beep of monitoring equipment. Richard Garrett had built an empire in biotechnology. His company had developed treatments that changed lives, pioneered research that pushed the boundaries of what science believed possible. Investors called him a visionary. Colleagues respected his relentless drive. But none of that mattered when it came to his 8-year-old son, Ethan. Ethan had been born with a rare neurological condition that doctors struggled to fully understand. By the time he was 2, it became clear that walking would not come naturally to him. By 4, specialists had declared it impossible. Richard had refused to accept that verdict. He had flown Ethan to the Mayo Clinic, to Johns Hopkins, to experimental treatment centers in Switzerland and Japan. They had tried stem cell therapy, cutting-edge medications, revolutionary surgical procedures. Each time, hope had been dangled like a carrot, only to be snatched away when the treatments failed to produce results. The wheelchair had become Ethan's constant companion. It was top-of-the-line, customized, worth more than most people's cars. But it was still a wheelchair, and every time Richard saw his son sitting in it, he felt like he had failed at the one thing that truly mattered. Mrs. Patricia Henderson had been with the Garrett family for 12 years. She had witnessed Amanda's decline, helped Richard through those first impossible months after her passing, and had taken it upon herself to ensure that the household ran with military precision. She managed the rotating staff of nurses, coordinated with Ethan's physical therapists, and made certain that every meal was nutritious, every surface spotless, every schedule followed to the minute. Patricia was a woman in her late 50s, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and a manner that discouraged familiarity. She believed in order, in routine, in maintaining appropriate boundaries. The house staff knew better than to deviate from their assigned duties or to question her decisions. She had created a system, and the system worked, even if it felt more like an institution than a home. Ethan spent most of his days in the converted sunroom that overlooked the garden. It had been transformed into a combination art studio and therapy space. The walls were lined with his paintings, bold strokes of color that seemed to contradict the muted tones of the rest of the house. For a child who couldn't walk, Ethan had found ways to move through his art. His paintings were full of motion, rivers flowing, birds in flight, children running through fields. He rarely spoke unless spoken to. The parade of therapists and specialists who cycled through his life had taught him that his body was a problem to be solved, a puzzle that frustrated everyone who tried to help him. He had learned to retreat into himself, to find solace in the quiet worlds he created with his paintbrush. It was late September when Sarah Coleman arrived at the Garrett mansion. She had been hired through an agency to cover for one of the regular housekeeping staff who was taking a 2-week vacation to visit family in Florida. Sarah was from a small town in rural Vermont, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a different pace than the frenetic energy of Boston. She was 34 years old, with warm brown eyes and hands that showed years of hard work. There was something understated about her presence, a quiet strength that didn't announce itself, but made itself felt nonetheless. She had worked various jobs over the years, cleaning offices, caring for elderly residents at a nursing home, whatever paid the bills and kept food on the table. The agency had been clear about the position. Temporary, 2 weeks maximum, excellent pay, strict household rules. Sarah needed the money. The past 3 years had been difficult, and she had learned to take opportunities when they presented themselves, even if it meant leaving her comfort zone and venturing into a world very different from the one she knew. Mrs. Henderson met her at the service entrance on her first morning, assessing her with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail. Sarah stood straight, met her gaze steadily, and listened carefully to the extensive list of rules and expectations. The house had to be cleaned according to a specific schedule. There were areas that were off-limits. The family valued their privacy. Under no circumstances was she to interact with the child beyond a polite greeting if their paths crossed. Sarah nodded, absorbing it all. She had worked in enough wealthy homes to understand the dynamics. Rich people liked their help to be invisible, to maintain the illusion that their perfect lives simply happened without effort. She could do invisible. She was good at it. The mansion was impressive, there was no denying that. High ceilings, expensive furniture, artwork that probably cost more than Sarah had earned in her entire life. But despite all its grandeur, something felt off about the place. It was too quiet, too controlled. Houses were meant to have a heartbeat, a rhythm of life that pulsed through their walls. This house felt like it was holding its breath. Sarah's duties began simply enough. She cleaned the guest bedrooms on the third floor, polished the banisters, vacuumed the Turkish rugs in the formal living room that looked like no one ever used it. Everything had its place, and she was careful to return items exactly as she found them. Mrs. Henderson made periodic rounds, checking her work with a critical eye, but Sarah's natural attention to detail seemed to meet her exacting standards. It was on her third day that Sarah first saw Ethan. She had been assigned to clean the hallway outside the sunroom. The door was partially open, and as she worked, she could see inside. The boy sat in his wheelchair at an easel, completely absorbed in his painting. His small hands moved with surprising confidence, mixing colors on a palette before applying them to the canvas. He was painting water, she realized, a river with light dancing on its surface. Something about the scene made Sarah pause. The concentration on the child's face, the way he seemed to pour himself into the work, the contrast between his immobile body and the fluid motion he was creating. Without thinking, she took a step closer to get a better look. Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Miss Coleman." Sarah turned to find the older woman standing behind her, arms crossed. "Your duties are in the hallway. The family's private spaces are not your concern." Sarah quickly apologized and returned to her cart, but the image of the boy stayed with her. That evening, back in her small rented room, she found herself thinking about him. There was something in his eyes that she recognized, an old sadness that didn't belong in someone so young. She had seen that look before, in the mirror, in the years after losing her own son, Michael. He would have been 11 now. The pain had dulled with time, transformed from a sharp blade into a constant ache, but it never truly went away. Sometimes she wondered if she was supposed to let it go, if holding on to it meant she was failing to move forward. But Michael had been her whole world, and forgetting felt like betrayal. Sarah shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. She was here to do a job, nothing more. 2 weeks, collect her pay, move on. Getting emotionally involved with her employer's family was not part of the plan. She had learned that lesson the hard way. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the boy in the wheelchair, painting rivers he might never walk beside. The following days settled into a rhythm. Sarah learned the patterns of the house, the times when Richard left for his office downtown, the rotation of nurses and therapists who came to work with Ethan, the precise way Mrs. Henderson liked the linens folded. She kept her head down and her work efficient, earning grudging approval from the housekeeper through her attention to detail. But she couldn't stop noticing things about Ethan, the way the house seemed to revolve around his schedule, yet he remained somehow peripheral to it all. The therapists worked on him rather than with him, following their protocols with professional detachment. The nurses checked his vitals and administered his medications with efficiency but little warmth. Even his father, on the rare occasions Sarah saw them interact, seemed to treat the boy like a fragile object that might break with too much direct contact. Sarah found herself paying attention to the sounds that carried through the house. She began to recognize Ethan's routine by ear, the soft hum of his wheelchair's motor, the classical music that played during his morning physical therapy sessions, the splash of water when they helped him with his bath, the quiet that descended in the afternoon when he painted. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that Sarah noticed something curious. She had been cleaning the windows in the adjoining corridor when a gust of wind from the garden doors blew through the sunroom. She heard Ethan laugh, a sound so unexpected in the silent house that she stopped what she was doing. Glancing through the doorway, she saw him turning his face toward the open window, eyes closed, a smile playing at his lips. The therapist who had been working with him looked up from her phone, momentarily surprised, then returned to her screen. But Sarah had seen it. The boy responded to the wind, to that sensation of air moving against his skin. It was such a small thing, yet it felt significant in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She began to watch more carefully, stealing glances when she could do so without attracting Mrs. Henderson's attention. Ethan seemed different when he painted, more animated, more present. When the nurses played music during his exercises, she noticed his fingers sometimes tapped rhythms against his wheelchair. Once, during a physical therapy session, she happened to be cleaning near. She saw him react when the therapist inadvertently touched a specific spot on his foot, a tiny flinch that might have gone unnoticed if she hadn't been looking for it. These observations troubled her. Sarah didn't have medical training, didn't have fancy degrees or letters after her name. She was just a woman who cleaned houses for a living. But she had instincts, and those instincts were telling her that something wasn't adding up. The child she was observing didn't match the picture everyone seemed to have of him, as someone whose condition was fixed and unchangeable. In the evenings, after finishing her work, Sarah found herself going to the public library. She didn't own a computer, and the internet on her old phone was frustratingly slow. The library stayed open until 9, and the librarians had grown accustomed to seeing her there. She started reading everything she could find about neurological conditions, about children with mobility issues, about something called neuroplasticity that suggested the brain could rewire itself under the right circumstances. The medical terminology was challenging, but Sarah was persistent. She took notes in a small spiral notebook, trying to make sense of what she was learning. Some articles talked about how the brain could find new pathways if given the right stimulation. Others discussed cases where children had made unexpected progress when approaches were changed or combined in novel ways. What struck her most was reading about how important environmental factors could be. How music, touch, temperature changes, even emotional states could trigger responses in the nervous system. She thought about Ethan's reaction to the wind, his engagement with his art, those tiny movements she had glimpsed. Sarah knew she was treading on dangerous ground. This wasn't her place. She was temporary help, would be gone in less than a week now. Getting involved in something this complicated could only end badly. But she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone had stopped looking, stopped hoping. They had built a system around Ethan that was comfortable and predictable, but maybe comfort wasn't what he needed. On her 8th day at the mansion, Sarah's carefully maintained distance began to crack. She had been assigned to clean the sunroom itself, while Ethan was supposed to be at a medical appointment. She was washing the large windows when she heard the wheelchair behind her. Turning, she found Ethan sitting in the doorway, watching her with those serious eyes that seemed to hold too much understanding. The appointment had been rescheduled, a nurse explained hurriedly as she rushed past to answer a phone call. Sarah and Ethan were alone for the first time. For a long moment, neither spoke. Sarah found herself uncertain, aware that Mrs. Henderson's rules were clear about interaction with the child. But Ethan was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to define, something that might have been curiosity, or perhaps recognition of someone who actually saw him rather than his wheelchair. "Your paintings are beautiful," Sarah said finally, the words coming before she could stop them. She gestured to the canvases lining the walls, especially that one of the river. "The way you captured the light on the water, it's remarkable." Ethan's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his features. "You really think so?" His voice was quiet, slightly hoarse from disuse, but clear. "I do," Sarah said honestly. "I grew up near a river in Vermont. You painted it exactly right, that quality of light. How it moves and changes. Most people don't see that." For the first time, Ethan smiled. Not the polite, restrained expression Sarah had seen him offer to therapists and nurses, but a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I've never seen a real river," he admitted, "just in pictures and videos, but I dream about them sometimes. About water that moves. The simple statement hit Sarah harder than she expected. A child who painted movement but had never experienced it, who dreamed of flowing water while trapped in stillness. Before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson's voice called from the hallway and the moment shattered. Sarah quickly returned to her work, and Ethan quietly maneuvered his wheelchair toward his easel. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement that had passed wordlessly. That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Ethan's words, about the disconnect between the life he lived and the life she sensed was possible for him. She thought about her grandmother, who had been a midwife and healer in their small Vermont community. Her grandmother had always said that bodies wanted to heal, wanted to move toward wholeness, but sometimes they needed to be listened to first, understood on their own terms, rather than forced into someone else's expectations. The next morning, Sarah made a decision that she knew was probably foolish, but felt necessary. During her break, while Mrs. Henderson was occupied with a grocery delivery, she slipped into Mr. Garrett's home office. It was off-limits to cleaning staff, but she had noticed that the filing cabinets were never locked. Her heart pounded as she quickly searched through the medical files, looking for anything related to Ethan's condition. What she found made her hands shake. Folders stuffed with reports from dozens of specialists, prescriptions for medications she couldn't pronounce, detailed notes from therapy sessions that all seemed to repeat the same conclusions. But buried beneath the recent files, she found older evaluations from when Ethan was much younger. These reports told a different story. Several early neurologists had noted potential for limited response to certain stimuli. One report specifically mentioned reflexive movements in the lower extremities when exposed to particular types of sensory input. But those optimistic notes seemed to have been abandoned. The more recent reports from the past 4 years all emphasize the same message. Condition stable, prognosis unchanged, focus on quality of life and adaptation. It was as if at some point, everyone had stopped looking for possibilities and started managing expectations instead. Sarah carefully photographed several pages with her phone, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with this information, but she knew it mattered. Someone needed to ask why those early observations had been dismissed. Someone needed to wonder if the lack of progress was because progress was impossible, or because they had stopped believing it could happen. As she closed the filing cabinet and slipped out of the office, Sarah caught her reflection in the window. She looked different, more determined than she had felt in years. Maybe it was reckless, maybe it was presumptuous. But for the first time since losing Michael, she felt a sense of purpose that went beyond simply surviving each day. Ethan deserved someone who believed in more than just managing his limitations. He deserved someone who would fight to discover what he might become. Sarah's final days at the Garrett mansion took on a new urgency. She knew her time was running out. The regular housekeeper would return in 3 days, and Sarah would go back to her life in Vermont, back to the small cleaning jobs and the quiet loneliness that had defined her existence for the past 3 years. But she couldn't leave without trying something, without at least planting a seed that might grow into possibility. She started small. When cleaning the sunroom, she began opening the windows more frequently, letting the autumn air flow through. She noticed how Ethan responded to it, the way his breathing deepened, how his attention sharpened. She started humming while she worked, old folk songs her grandmother had taught her, and saw how his fingers moved slightly, as if trying to find the rhythm. One afternoon, when the nurse had stepped out to take a phone call, Sarah took a chance. She approached Ethan's wheelchair, where he sat looking out at the garden. "Can I show you something?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up at her, curious and slightly cautious. "What?" "Give me your hand," Sarah said. When he hesitantly complied, she gently pressed his palm against a smooth river stone she had brought from Vermont, one of the few possessions she carried with her. "Close your eyes. Feel the texture. Imagine it's been sitting in cold water for 100 years. Feel how smooth it is, how the water shaped it." Ethan closed his eyes, his small fingers exploring the stone's surface. For a moment he was completely still, absorbed in the sensation. "It's cool," he said quietly. "Smooth but not slippery. There's a little rough patch here, like the water couldn't reach it." "Exactly," Sarah said, her voice warm with encouragement. "Your hands know how to feel things. They understand texture, temperature, shape. Your body is smarter than people give it credit for. The sound of footsteps made Sarah quickly pocket the stone and step back. The nurse returned, barely glancing at them as she checked Ethan's schedule on her tablet. But Ethan looked at Sarah with new awareness, as if she had opened a door he didn't know existed. That night, Sarah lay awake in her room, wrestling with herself. What she was considering was dangerous. It could cost her this job, could even cause problems beyond that. But the image of those old medical reports kept haunting her. Somewhere along the way, the people caring for Ethan had stopped believing. They had built their certainty on conclusions that might have been premature, might have missed something crucial. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. The body talks if you know how to listen. Sometimes a whisper is just as important as a shout. The next evening, Sarah made her move. She waited until the night nurse had settled Ethan into bed and retired to the adjacent room, where she monitored him via a baby monitor. The mansion was quiet, most of the staff gone for the day. Richard working late in his downtown office. Mrs. Henderson had retired to her quarters on the first floor. Sarah slipped into Ethan's room, her heart hammering. The boy was awake, reading a book with a small LED light clipped to the pages. He looked up, startled but not frightened. "I'm not supposed to be here," Sarah whispered, "but I need to try something. Will you trust me?" Ethan studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Sarah carefully pulled back the light blanket covering his legs. Through his pajama pants, she began to apply gentle pressure to different points on his feet, techniques she had learned from watching videos and reading articles. She wasn't trying to perform therapy. She was trying to listen, to see if his body would tell her something everyone else had stopped asking about. For several minutes, nothing happened. Sarah worked methodically, varying the pressure, the location, the pattern. She was about to give up when she felt it. A tiny movement, barely perceptible, a flex of the muscle beneath her hand. She held her breath and tried again. There it was. Weak, inconsistent, but real. "Did you feel that?" she asked Ethan. "Feel what?" he responded, confusion in his voice. "Your foot just moved." "Just a little bit, but it moved." Ethan's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "I didn't feel anything." "I'm sure," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "The movement was there. Your nervous system is responding, even if you can't feel it yet consciously." She tried several more times, documenting in her mind exactly what produced the response and what didn't. Certain types of pressure, certain locations, certain patterns seemed to trigger minute reactions. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a crack in the certainty that had been built around Ethan's condition. The next morning, Sarah's luck ran out. Mrs. Henderson came to inspect the upstairs hallway and found Sarah lingering near Ethan's room when she should have been working in the guest quarters. The older woman's suspicion, already aroused by Sarah's small departures from protocol, crystallized into certainty that something inappropriate was happening. "Miss Coleman, a word, please." "In my office now." Sarah followed Mrs. Henderson downstairs, her mind racing. The housekeeper closed the office door with deliberate care, then turned to face her with an expression that could have frozen fire. "I have been patient with you because your work has been satisfactory," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice clipped. "But I have noticed a pattern of behavior that concerns me greatly. You have been spending time near Master Ethan when you should be attending to your duties. I have seen the way you watch him. Yesterday, the nurse mentioned finding you talking to him alone. And this morning I found you outside his bedroom when you were supposed to be elsewhere." Sarah took a deep breath. She could deny everything, could apologize and promise to maintain proper boundaries for her remaining 2 days. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice. Instead, she heard herself saying, "I need to speak with Mr. Garrett." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Excuse me?" "There's something he needs to know about his son. Something important. Something that might make a difference." The housekeeper's expression shifted from anger to something closer to concern. "Ms. Coleman, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but these are dangerous waters you're wading into. Mr. Garrett has spent enormous resources seeking help for Ethan. The finest specialists in the world have examined that child. Whatever amateur observations you believe you've made are not going to change medical reality." "Then it shouldn't matter if I speak with him," Sarah countered, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if there's even a chance I'm right, Doesn't Ethan deserve to have someone ask the questions? Mrs. Henderson regarded her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Finally, she picked up the phone. I'll call Mr. Garrett, but understand this. If you have wasted his time with nonsense, you will not work in this city again. I will personally ensure it. Richard Garrett arrived home within the hour, his expression thunderous. He had been pulled from an important meeting, told only that there was an urgent matter concerning his son. He strode into Mrs. Henderson's office where Sarah had been waiting, his presence filling the space with barely contained frustration. This better be important, he said coldly, not bothering with pleasantries. I was in the middle of negotiations that could determine my company's future. Sarah stood, forcing herself to meet his gaze, despite the intimidation she felt. Mr. Garrett, I know I'm overstepping my position. I know I'm just temporary help and I have no medical credentials. But I've been watching your son, and I've found something in his medical files that I think you need to know about. Richard's expression went from angry to dangerous. You went through my private files? Yes, sir, I did. And I found evaluations from when Ethan was younger that mentioned responsiveness to certain stimuli. Those observations seem to have been abandoned, but last night I tested some of those same stimuli, and Mr. Garrett, his muscles responded. Not much, not consistently, but they responded. The reflexes are there. The room went utterly silent. Mrs. Henderson looked pale. Richard stared at Sarah as if she had lost her mind. You tested, Richard repeated slowly, each word like a chip of ice. My son? Without permission? Without supervision? Without any medical training whatsoever? I know how it sounds, Sarah said, fighting to keep her voice from shaking. But I'm telling you what I felt. I'm telling you that the conclusions everyone has reached about his condition might not be complete. I'm asking you to have him evaluated again by someone who will look with fresh eyes. Richard Garrett felt rage surging through him like a physical force. This woman, this temporary cleaning person, had invaded his privacy, manipulated his son, and was now standing before him claiming to know something that teams of world-renowned specialists had missed. The audacity was breathtaking. Get out, he said, his voice low and controlled in the way that made his business rivals nervous. Pack your things and leave my house immediately. You're fired. If I find out you've breathed a word of my son's private medical information to anyone, I will pursue legal action. Sarah didn't move. I understand your anger, Mr. Garrett. If someone had done this to my son, I would have reacted the same way. But I'm not leaving until you look at what I've found. She pulled out her phone, hands trembling slightly, and brought up the photographs she had taken of the medical files. These are from 6 years ago. Dr. Morrison noted minimal but measurable responses in the lower extremities when specific types of sensory input were applied. She recommended continued monitoring and various therapeutic approaches. But I can't find any follow-up reports on those recommendations. The next evaluations from a different specialist don't mention them at all. It's like that avenue of possibility just closed, and everyone accepted it without question. Richard snatched the phone from her hand, his eyes scanning the documents. He remembered that evaluation. It had been shortly before Amanda got sick, when they were still hopeful, still trying everything. Dr. Morrison had been cautiously optimistic, had suggested they keep exploring. But then Amanda's condition had deteriorated so rapidly, and in the chaos of caring for her while trying to manage Ethan's needs, they had switched to Dr. Reeves, who had taken a more conservative approach. Dr. Reeves had been so certain. He had laid out the medical realities with clarity and compassion, explaining that chasing false hope would only make things harder for everyone, especially Ethan. He had recommended focusing on adaptation, on building a life that worked within Ethan's limitations, rather than exhausting everyone with endless therapies that produced no results. And after years of disappointment, after watching his wife slip away while feeling powerless to save her, Richard had welcomed that certainty. It had felt like permission to stop fighting impossible battles. You have no idea what you're talking about, Richard said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. I have no idea what we've been through, what we've tried. You're right, Sarah said quietly. I don't know all of it, but I know what I felt. I know that your son's body responded when I applied pressure to specific points. I know that he reacts to sensory input in ways that suggest his nervous system is more active than his current treatment assumes. And I know that sometimes when we're told something is impossible often enough, we stop seeing evidence to the contrary. Mrs. Henderson, who had been watching this exchange with growing unease, spoke up. "Mr. Garrett, perhaps we should contact Dr. Reeves. He could put this matter to rest quickly." Richard was quiet for a long moment, Sarah's phone still in his hand. He thought about Ethan, about the resignation he saw in his son's eyes when another therapy session ended with no progress. He thought about Amanda, about how she had made him promise in those final weeks to never stop believing in possibilities for their son. He thought about the empire he had built on the principle that yesterday's impossible was often tomorrow's breakthrough. "Dr. Morrison," he said finally, "the original neurologist who did these early evaluations. Is she still practicing?" Sarah nodded. "She's at Boston Children's Hospital now. She's considered one of the leading pediatric neurologists in the country." Richard made a decision that felt both reckless and necessary. "Mrs. Henderson, call Dr. Morrison's office. Tell them I need an emergency consultation. Tell them I'll pay whatever fee necessary to get Ethan seen this week." He turned back to Sarah. "You're not fired. Not yet. But if this turns out to be nothing, if you've given me false hope, I promise you'll regret it." The appointment was scheduled for 2 days later. Dr. Ellen Morrison, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and an air of professional competence, remembered Ethan immediately. "I've wondered about him over the years," she admitted as she reviewed his current files. "I was disappointed when you stopped bringing him to me. Dr. Reeves is excellent, but we had different philosophies about treatment approach." "What do you mean?" Richard asked. "Dr. Reeves believes in accepting limitations and building quality of life within them. It's a valid approach, and for many patients it's the right one. But I've always believed in keeping doors open, in continuing to test and explore, especially with pediatric neurology where we're still learning so much. Children's brains are remarkably plastic. What seems fixed at one age might become flexible at another." Dr. Morrison spent over an hour with Ethan, running tests that were more comprehensive than anything he had undergone in years. She applied various types of sensory input, measured responses with sophisticated equipment, asked questions about his daily experiences that no one had asked in a long time. Sarah, who Richard had grudgingly allowed to attend, watched with her heart in her throat. When Dr. Morrison finally finished, she sat down with Richard, Sarah, and Mrs. Henderson in her consultation office. "I'm going to be very clear about what I found," she began. "Ethan does have measurable responses in his lower extremities. They're inconsistent and weak, but they're present. More importantly, they're different from what I observed 6 years ago. In some ways weaker, but in other ways more specific. His nervous system has been reorganizing itself, but without targeted intervention. It's been doing so in ways that don't translate to functional improvement." Richard felt something break open in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name. "What does that mean?" "It means that with intensive, specifically designed neurological rehabilitation, there's a possibility, and I want to emphasize that it's only a possibility, that Ethan could develop some degree of motor function. It would require commitment, time, and acceptance that progress might be minimal. But the potential exists. It existed 6 years ago, and surprisingly, it still exists now." "Why surprisingly?" Sarah asked. Dr. Morrison turned to her. "Because typically, without intervention, these kinds of latent responses fade as the brain accepts alternative neural pathways. The fact that they're still present, still accessible, suggests that Ethan's nervous system has been maintaining these connections despite lack of use. It's actually quite remarkable." She pulled up imaging scans on her computer. "There's something else. When I compare these new scans to the ones from 6 years ago, I see signs that certain neural pathways have been stimulated recently. Something in his environment or routine has been keeping these connections alive. Do you know what that might be?" Richard looked at Sarah, understanding dawning. The wind through open windows, the textures, the rhythms, all the small things she had been introducing, probably breaking dozens of Mrs. Henderson's rules in the process. She had been listening to what Ethan's body was trying to say, and somehow, against all odds, she had been right. "There's a facility in Rochester, Minnesota," Dr. Morrison continued. "They specialize in intensive pediatric neurorehabilitation. The program is grueling, requires a minimum 3-month commitment, and success is never guaranteed. But if any place can help Ethan reach his potential, whatever that might be, it's there. Dr. James Sullivan runs the program. I can make an introduction if you're interested. Richard sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the decision before him. Another round of hope, another chance for disappointment, but also, perhaps, another chance for Ethan to become more than everyone had decided he could be. He thought about the businessman who had told him biotech was too risky, that his ideas would never work. He had proven them wrong by refusing to accept their certainty. Set it up, he said. Whatever it takes, Dr. Morrison smiled. I'll make the call today, but Mr. Garrett, I want you to understand something. This isn't a miracle cure scenario. Progress will be measured in tiny increments. There will be setbacks. Ethan will work harder than he's ever worked in his life, and the results might not be what you're hoping for. But at least you'll know you explored every possibility. I understand, Richard said. Then he turned to Sarah, who had been sitting quietly through most of the consultation. I owe you an apology. And apparently I owe you much more than that. Sarah shook her head. You don't owe me anything, Mr. Garrett. I just wanted Ethan to have a chance. As they left the hospital, Richard found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew. About his son, about the strangers who entered their lives, about the difference between accepting reality and giving up too soon. The temporary cleaning person from Vermont had seen something that he, with all his resources and determination, had missed. She had looked at his son not as a problem to be managed, but as a person with untapped potential. That evening, Richard made another decision. Sarah, your original job ends tomorrow, but I'd like to offer you a different position. Come to Rochester with us. Help with Ethan during this program. You've connected with him in a way no one else has. I think he needs that. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Going to Rochester would mean leaving Vermont, leaving the familiar patterns of her life, stepping into a world far outside her comfort zone. But when she thought about Ethan, about the possibility of helping him discover what he might become, the answer was clear. Yes, she said simply. I'll come. Rochester, Minnesota, in late October, carried a different kind of cold than Boston. It was sharper, more honest somehow, cutting through pretense the way the winter wind cut through clothing. The rehabilitation facility where Ethan would spend the next several months sat on the edge of town, a modern building that managed to feel both clinical and welcoming. Dr. James Sullivan was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and hands that moved with precise confidence. He had reviewed Ethan's files extensively before their arrival, and his first meeting with the family was refreshingly direct. I'm not going to make promises I can't keep, he said, addressing Richard, Sarah, and Ethan together. What we do here is intensive, demanding, and sometimes painful. Ethan will be pushed to his absolute limits, physically and emotionally. Some days he'll hate me, hate his therapists, hate everyone involved in this process, and at the end of it all we might see significant improvement, minimal improvement, or something in between. What I can promise is that we'll learn exactly what's possible. Ethan, sitting in his wheelchair with Sarah's hand resting lightly on his shoulder, spoke up for the first time. Will it hurt? Dr. Sullivan crouched down to meet the boy's eyes at his level. Sometimes, yes, but not the kind of hurt that damages you. The kind of hurt that comes from muscles learning to work in new ways. Your body is going to have to relearn things, build connections between your brain and your legs that either never formed properly or got interrupted. That process isn't comfortable, but I think you're brave enough to handle it. The question is, do you want to try? Ethan looked at his father, then at Sarah, then back at Dr. Sullivan. If I try really hard, could I maybe walk? Even just a little bit? Maybe, Dr. Sullivan said honestly. Or maybe what you'll gain is better control over the movements you already have. Maybe it'll be something we can't predict yet. But I can tell you this. You'll be stronger than you are now in ways that go beyond just your legs. You'll know what it means to fight for something and give it everything you have. That's worth something all by itself. Okay, Ethan said quietly. I want to try. The program began the next day. Ethan's schedule was intense. 2 hours of targeted physical therapy in the morning, an hour of occupational therapy, lunch, another hour of neuromuscular stimulation therapy, time for homework and rest, then an evening session of hydrotherapy. Sarah attended as many sessions as they would allow, watching, learning, offering encouragement when Ethan's determination wavered. The first week was brutal. Ethan's body, so long adapted to immobility, rebelled against the demands being placed on it. His muscles cramped. His joints ached. He cried from frustration and pain, and more than once told his father he wanted to quit, to go home, to go back to the way things were. Richard struggled with watching his son suffer. Every tear, every moment of pain felt like a betrayal of his duty to protect. He found himself questioning the decision, wondering if Dr. Reeves had been right all along, if accepting limitations was kinder than chasing possibilities. It was Sarah who steadied him during those difficult moments. "He's not breaking," she said one evening after a particularly hard session. "He's growing. It looks painful from the outside, and it is painful. But it's the pain of becoming, not the pain of being destroyed. There's a difference." "How can you be sure?" Richard asked, the exhaustion evident in his voice. "Because I've been where you are," Sarah said softly. "When my son Michael was sick, I watched him suffer through treatments that I knew were necessary, but that hurt him terribly. Every time he cried, I wanted to stop it all, to just hold him and keep him comfortable. But he was fighting for his life, and the pain was part of that fight. This is different, but the principle is the same. Ethan is fighting for his life too, just not in the way we usually think about it. He's fighting for the life he might have, not just the life he's been given." Richard had learned pieces of Sarah's story over the past weeks. The son she had lost, the years of grief that followed, the way she had slowly rebuilt herself into someone who could function but never quite feel whole. He understood now why she had connected so deeply with Ethan, why she had taken the risk of confronting him despite having no right or authority to do so. "I never thanked you properly," he said, "for seeing what I couldn't see." Sarah smiled slightly. "You were too close to see it. Sometimes it takes an outsider's eyes. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." By the third week, something began to shift. Ethan stopped crying during sessions. His jaw would set with determination, and he would push through the pain with a focus that impressed even the seasoned therapists. Dr. Sullivan noted the change during one of his weekly progress meetings. "Ethan is demonstrating remarkable mental resilience," he said. "Most children his age hit a wall around week 2 and need significant encouragement to push past it. He's found something inside himself, some reserve of strength we don't usually see this early in treatment." The physical progress was slower than the emotional progress, but it was there. Tiny movements that Ethan couldn't control before were becoming more intentional. The muscle spasms that Sarah had first detected were evolving into something that resembled voluntary contractions, though still weak and inconsistent. During the hydrotherapy sessions, which took place in a warm therapeutic pool, Ethan showed the most dramatic responses. The buoyancy of the water reduced the gravity that made movement so difficult, and with the support of therapists, he began to experience what it felt like to extend his legs, to push against resistance, to feel his body respond to his intentions. Sarah often sat poolside during these sessions, and she noticed how Ethan's entire demeanor changed in the water. The tension that usually gripped his small frame relaxed. His face, so often serious and drawn, became animated. He laughed sometimes, genuine sounds of joy that reminded her of the child he might have been, without the limitations that had defined his life. Richard noticed too. He had rearranged his entire business life to be present for this. Conference calls were conducted from the apartment they had rented near the facility. Meetings happened via video link. His executives were managing the day-to-day operations. And while part of him worried about losing control of his empire, a larger part was discovering that some things mattered more than market share and profit margins. He and Sarah fell into an easy partnership. She understood Ethan's moods and needs in ways that Richard was still learning. He provided the resources and authority to ensure Ethan got the best possible care. They communicated about schedules, about small victories and setbacks, about the 1,000 practical details of this new life they were building together. Somewhere in that partnership, a deeper connection began to form, though neither spoke of it explicitly. Mrs. Henderson had remained in Boston, managing the mansion and the reduced household staff. She called weekly for updates, her initial skepticism about the whole enterprise gradually softening as she heard the changes in Ethan's voice when they spoke. Even she could hear that something fundamental was shifting in the boy. By week 6, Dr. Sullivan called them all together for a significant meeting. "I want to show you something," he said, pulling up a series of imaging scans on his computer. "These are Ethan's neural pathways from when he arrived, and these are from yesterday. Do you see these areas here? The increased activity? The new connections forming? This is neuroplasticity in action. Ethan's brain is rewiring itself, building new pathways to control muscles that it couldn't access before." "What does it mean in practical terms?" Richard asked, leaning forward to study the images. "It means that the work we're doing is having a measurable impact at the neurological level. Whether that will translate to functional walking is still uncertain. But it definitely means that continued intensive therapy is worthwhile. I'd like to extend the program if you're willing. Another 3 months with adjusted protocols based on what we've learned so far." Richard looked at Ethan, who nodded eagerly despite the exhaustion evident in his thin frame. "Yes," Richard said, "whatever it takes." That night, after Ethan was asleep, Richard and Sarah sat in the small living room of their rented apartment. The space was nothing like the mansion in Boston, but it felt more like home than that place ever had. Sarah was reviewing Ethan's daily progress notes, something she had started doing to track patterns and share observations with the therapy team. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said suddenly. Sarah looked up. "Of course. Why did you really do it? Risk your job? Confront me, involve yourself in a situation that any reasonable person would have walked away from?" Sarah set down the notebook, considering the question. "Do you remember when I told you about my son, Michael?" Richard nodded. "What I didn't tell you was how he passed. He had a rare form of childhood disorder that doctors said was untreatable. They told me to make him comfortable, to accept what was coming, but I couldn't accept it. I researched, I pushed for experimental treatments, I fought every step of the way, and in the end it didn't matter. I lost him anyway." Her voice was steady, but Richard could see the pain beneath the surface. "For a long time I blamed myself for that fight. I thought maybe if I had just accepted what the doctors said, Michael's final months would have been more peaceful, less filled with hospitals and procedures. I carried that guilt like a stone." She looked directly at Richard. "When I saw Ethan, when I found those old reports suggesting possibility that had been abandoned, I saw a chance to do things differently. Not to save him from something terminal, but to save him from a life that might be more limited than it needed to be. And this time I was right. This time the fight was worth it. That doesn't bring Michael back, but it means his passing wasn't completely without purpose. It taught me to trust my instincts, to believe that sometimes the impossible is just the not yet possible." Richard found himself reaching for her hand, a gesture that felt natural despite the professional boundaries that had defined their relationship. "I think Michael would be proud of his mother. I think he'd be glad that his life, even though it was too short, taught you something that could help another child." Sarah squeezed his hand, tears shining in her eyes, but not falling. "I hope so. I really do." The extended program brought new challenges and new breakthroughs. By month 4, Ethan could maintain standing position with support for almost 30 seconds. His leg muscles, so long dormant, were developing definition. The trembling that had characterized his early attempts at movement was becoming steadier, more controlled. He still couldn't walk independently, might never walk independently, but the impossible was becoming slightly less impossible with each passing week. The therapy team adjusted their approach based on continuous assessment. They incorporated more activities that Ethan enjoyed, making therapy feel less like punishment and more like exploration. During art therapy sessions, Ethan painted while standing at an easel, using the creative process to build core strength and balance. In music therapy, rhythmic movements helped establish neural patterns that translated to better motor control. Sarah had become an integral part of the team. Her observations, initially dismissed by some of the more traditionally minded therapists, proved valuable enough that Dr. Sullivan began asking for her input during treatment planning sessions. She had an intuitive understanding of Ethan's limits and potential that complemented the medical team's technical expertise. Richard, meanwhile, was undergoing his own transformation. The CEO who had ruled his empire with exacting control learned to surrender to the uncertainty of Ethan's rehabilitation. He learned to celebrate tiny victories, to accept setbacks without catastrophizing, to be present in the moment rather than always strategizing 3 steps ahead. His relationship with his son deepened in ways he hadn't anticipated. They talked more, really talked, about fears and hopes, and the future Ethan was slowly building for himself. And through it all, the connection between Richard and Sarah continued to evolve. It remained unspoken, undefined, existing in the space of shared glances and small gestures. A hand on a shoulder during a difficult moment. Quiet conversations late at night when sleep wouldn't come. The comfortable silence of two people who understood each other's pain and possibility. Neither was ready to name what was growing between them, both still carrying ghosts that complicated any thought of moving forward. But it was there, undeniable and growing stronger. It was in the 5th month that everything changed. A journalist from a prominent Boston newspaper, working on a story about innovative pediatric rehabilitation programs, visited the Rochester facility. The clinic's media relations team had approved the visit, seeing it as an opportunity to highlight their work. What they hadn't anticipated was that the reporter would recognize Richard Garrett. Richard was a public figure in Boston's business community. His biotech company was frequently mentioned in financial news. His philanthropy had put his name on buildings. He wasn't a celebrity in the traditional sense, but he was recognizable enough that a savvy journalist would know who he was and would understand that a story about the biotech magnate's son undergoing experimental treatment was worth pursuing. The story broke on a Tuesday morning. Biotech CEO's son making miraculous progress at Minnesota Rehabilitation Center, read the headline. The article was sympathetic, focusing on hope and medical innovation, but it included details that Richard had never intended to share publicly. Ethan's condition, the years of failed treatments, the discovery that renewed possibilities had been overlooked, and most problematically, it mentioned Sarah by name, describing her as the family friend whose observations led to the breakthrough. By noon, the story had been picked up by wire services. By evening, television crews were requesting interviews. Richard's phone exploded with messages from business associates, friends he hadn't spoken to in years, and media outlets wanting exclusive access to Ethan's story. Dr. Sullivan called an emergency meeting. We need to control this situation before it spirals further. The facility is receiving dozens of calls. We've had 3 different news vans outside the building. This kind of attention could disrupt not just Ethan's treatment, but the entire program for all our patients. Richard's business instincts kicked in. I'll issue a statement. Request privacy for medical treatment. Decline all interview requests. This should die down in a few days once people realize there's no story to pursue. But it didn't die down. If anything, the attention intensified. Parent advocacy groups reached out, wanting to know more about the treatment protocols that were helping Ethan. Other families with children in similar situations sought information, hoping for the same breakthrough. The rehabilitation facility's phone system was overwhelmed with inquiries. More troubling were the skeptics and conspiracy theorists who emerged online. Some suggested the entire story was fabricated for publicity. Others accused Richard of using his wealth to access treatments denied to regular families. A particularly nasty thread on social media suggested that Sarah was a con artist who had manipulated a grieving father for financial gain. Sarah read some of the comments one evening and felt sick. They're saying I made up Michael's story. They're saying I saw a rich family and invented a way to exploit them. How can people be so cruel? Richard found her in the apartment's small kitchen, staring at her phone with tears streaming down her face. He gently took the device from her hands. Don't read that garbage. Those people don't know you. They don't know us. They're just throwing stones from the safety of anonymity. But Ethan might see this stuff. Other kids at the facility will hear about it. What if it affects his progress? What if the stress of all this attention undoes everything we've worked for? It was a legitimate concern. Ethan had been sheltered from most of the media storm, but he wasn't oblivious. He had heard the whispered conversations, noticed the increased security at the facility, felt the tension radiating from his father and Sarah. That night at dinner, he finally asked the question they had been dreading. Why are there so many people outside? Why do they want to talk about me? Richard set down his fork, choosing his words carefully. Because your progress is remarkable, and people are interested in remarkable things, but it's also made things complicated in ways we didn't expect. Do they think I'm lying? That I'm not really getting better? Some people are skeptical of anything they don't understand, Sarah said gently. That says more about them than it does about you. You know what's real. We know what's real. That's what matters. Ethan was quiet for a moment, pushing food around his plate. I don't want to stop treatment because of this. You won't, Richard assured him. Dr. Sullivan and I are working on a plan to reduce the attention while protecting your privacy. But Ethan, I need you to understand something. This situation might get harder before it gets better. Are you okay with that? Ethan nodded slowly. If it means I can keep trying to walk, I can handle hard. The wisdom in that simple statement struck both adults silent. This 8-year-old child, who had every reason to retreat from challenge, who could have chosen comfort over effort, was demonstrating a strength that humbled them both. Dr. Sullivan's solution was to relocate Ethan's therapy to a private wing of the facility with restricted access. A security firm was hired to manage the perimeter and prevent unauthorized entry. Richard arranged for a legal team to send cease and desist letters to the most aggressive media outlets. And in a move that surprised everyone, he agreed to one comprehensive interview with a respected medical journalist, hoping that addressing the story head-on would satisfy curiosity and allow them to return to privacy. The interview was carefully controlled. Richard spoke about Ethan's journey, without revealing details that would compromise his privacy. He emphasized that every child's situation was unique, that what worked for Ethan might not work for others, that there were no guarantees or miracle cures. He praised the facility's team and acknowledged Sarah's role in observing possibilities that had been overlooked. But he made clear that she was not practicing medicine, simply being observant in ways that happened to be helpful. The interview seemed to work. The initial feeding frenzy subsided. Most media outlets moved on to other stories. The facility's phone system returned to normal. Security was able to relax slightly. Life began to settle back into the intensive but manageable rhythm of rehabilitation. But something had changed. The exposure, however unwanted, had brought their unconventional family unit into sharper focus. Richard, Sarah, and Ethan were bonded by more than circumstance now. They had weathered external scrutiny together, had protected each other from invasive attention, had chosen to continue forward despite pressure to retreat. One evening, after Ethan was asleep, Richard and Sarah sat on the small balcony of their apartment, watching snow begin to fall. The Minnesota winter had arrived in earnest, transforming the landscape into something that felt separate from the rest of the world. I never asked if you had someone back in Vermont, Richard said suddenly. Someone who might be wondering where you went or why you've stayed here so long. Sarah smiled slightly. No, there's no one. After Michael passed, I closed myself off pretty completely. It was easier to be alone than to risk letting anyone in. What about you? You must have had people interested. A successful, handsome widower raising a son. That's catnip for a certain type of person. I went on a few dates, Richard admitted, mostly at the insistence of friends who thought I needed to move on. They were all perfectly nice women, accomplished, intelligent, attractive, but I couldn't connect with any of them. They didn't understand Ethan, didn't understand the reality of our life. They wanted the idea of me, not the complicated truth. And what is the complicated truth? Richard turned to look at her directly. The truth is that for 3 years, I've been going through the motions of living without actually being alive, working, managing, maintaining, but not feeling much of anything beyond worry and exhaustion. Until you showed up and made me feel something again, made me hope again, made me want to be better, not just for Ethan, but for myself. Sarah's breath caught. Richard, I don't know if this is the right time. We're in the middle of something so important with Ethan. I don't want to complicate that. I'm not asking for anything to change right now, Richard said. I'm just telling you the truth. Whatever this is between us, however it evolves or doesn't evolve, I want you to know that you've given me back something I thought I had lost. And I'm grateful for that, regardless of what comes next. Sarah reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. I feel it too. There's something between us. It terrifies me, if I'm honest. The idea of caring about someone again, of risking that kind of loss. But I also feel more alive than I have in years. So maybe terrified isn't such a bad place to be. They sat like that for a long time, holding hands in the falling snow, not needing to say anything more. As winter deepened into February, Ethan's progress accelerated in ways that surprised even Dr. Sullivan's experienced team. The boy who had arrived unable to control his leg muscles was now taking supported steps with the aid of parallel bars and 2 therapists. Each step was laborious, requiring intense concentration and effort that left him drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion. But they were steps. Real, measurable forward movement. The transformation wasn't purely physical. Ethan's entire demeanor had changed. The quiet, withdrawn child who had accepted his limitations with resigned sadness had become vocal about his needs and determined in his efforts. He asked questions during therapy sessions, pushed back when he thought therapists weren't challenging him enough, and celebrated his own victories with unguarded joy. His paintings had evolved too. Where they once depicted motion he could only imagine, they now showed figures in active poses that reflected his growing understanding of how bodies moved through space. He painted a series of pieces showing a child learning to walk, each canvas capturing a different stage of the process. The final painting in the series remained blank, waiting. "I'll paint it when I know how the story ends," he told Sarah one afternoon as they looked at the collection together. "I want to be honest about what's really possible, not what I wish was possible." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. At 8 years old, Ethan was demonstrating a maturity that many adults never achieved. You know, the story might not end the way you expect, but that doesn't make it any less true or valuable. Sometimes the journey matters more than the destination. That's what Dr. Sullivan says. But I still want to walk on my own, even if it's just across a room. Is that okay to want? It's more than okay, Sarah assured him. Wanting things, hoping for things, that's what keeps us moving forward. Just remember that whatever happens, you're already so much stronger than when you started. That counts for something huge. But behind the encouraging words, Sarah felt anxiety building. The 6-month mark of the extended program was approaching. Decisions would need to be made about what came next. Ethan would need continued therapy, but did it need to be in Rochester? Could they find adequate support back in Boston? And what would happen to the delicate balance they had created, this makeshift family that had formed around Ethan's rehabilitation? Richard was grappling with similar questions. His company had managed well enough in his absence, but his board was growing restless. They wanted him back in Boston, focused on the business that had built his fortune. There were opportunities being missed, competitors gaining ground, investors asking uncomfortable questions about leadership stability. His CFO had flown to Rochester twice in the past month to discuss matters too sensitive for video conference. Late one night, after a particularly difficult conversation with his board chairman, Richard found Sarah in the apartment's small home office, reviewing research articles on long-term therapy options for children with neurological conditions. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She looked up, noting the tension in his jaw. "Worried about what comes next." "You?" "Same." He sat down across from her, running a hand through his hair. "They want me back, full-time in person, engaged with the business in ways I haven't been for months. They're not wrong to ask for it. I built that company. I have responsibilities to employees, shareholders, to research projects that could help people. But I also have Ethan, and he's not ready for what comes next." "What does ready look like?" Sarah asked. "I don't know anymore. I thought I knew what I wanted for him. I thought walking was the goal, the finish line we were racing toward. But now I'm starting to understand what you and Dr. Sullivan have been trying to tell me. There might not be a finish line. There might just be continuous progress, continuous adaptation, continuous work. And I don't know how to build a life around that while also running a biotech empire." Sarah closed her laptop, giving him her full attention. "Can I tell you something I've learned? You don't build a life around anything. You build a life from the materials you have at any given moment. Right now you have a son who's making remarkable progress. You have a business that's been functioning without your constant oversight. You have options you didn't have 6 months ago. The question isn't what you should do. It's what you want to do. I want to be there for Ethan. I want to see this through wherever it leads. But I also want to maintain the work that gives our life stability and meaning. Is it selfish to want both?" "It's human," Sarah said gently. "You're not required to sacrifice everything for one part of your life. That's not healthy for you or for Ethan. He needs a father who's fulfilled and engaged, not one who's resentful about what he gave up." Their conversation was interrupted by a cry from Ethan's room. Both adults rushed in to find him sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his face, his hands gripping the sheets. "What is it?" "What's wrong?" Richard asked, immediately checking for signs of physical distress. "I felt it," Ethan sobbed. "I felt my legs. Not just the therapy feeling where things happen, but I don't really feel it. I actually felt them. It hurt, like pins and needles, but I felt it." Dr. Sullivan had warned them this might happen. As neural pathways rebuilt, sensations sometimes returned in unpredictable ways. It could be uncomfortable, even painful, as nerves that had been dormant suddenly began transmitting signals again. But it was also a profoundly positive sign. Sarah sat on the edge of Ethan's bed, taking his hand. "I know it's scary, but this is actually wonderful news. Your nervous system is reconnecting. The pathways we've been working to rebuild are starting to function. The pain will get better as your body adjusts." "But what if it doesn't?" Ethan asked, his voice small and frightened. "What if it just keeps hurting? What if feeling my legs means they hurt all the time?" Richard found himself without adequate words. His instinct was to promise that everything would be fine, but he had learned that such promises were empty when you couldn't guarantee them. Instead, he sat on the other side of the bed and pulled his son into a careful hug. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "If the pain continues, we'll work with Dr. Sullivan to manage it. But Ethan, think about what this means. For years you haven't been able to feel anything below your knees. Now you can. Yes, it's uncomfortable right now, but it's also connection. It's your body talking to you in ways it hasn't been able to before." They stayed with Ethan until he fell back asleep, taking turns keeping watch through the night in case the sensation recurred. In the quiet hours before dawn, sitting together in chairs pulled close to Ethan's bed, Richard and Sarah shared a look that communicated what words couldn't. They were in this together, whatever came next. The incident accelerated decision-making. Dr. Sullivan recommended they plan for at least another 3 months in Rochester, possibly 6, to stabilize Ethan's progress and ensure the returning sensation didn't cause complications. But he also acknowledged that eventually they would need to transition to a maintenance program that could be managed closer to home. Richard made his choice. He would return to Boston for 3 days each week, handling essential business in person, while maintaining his primary focus on Ethan's rehabilitation. His board would have to accept that arrangement or find new leadership. It wasn't ideal for anyone, but it was the best compromise he could offer. Sarah's decision was more complicated. She had no business to return to, no obligations pulling her elsewhere. But she also had no formal role in Ethan's life, no official reason to remain part of his care team. She was nominally employed as a personal assistant to Richard, a job title that covered the reality of her involvement without fully defining it. One afternoon, while Ethan was in a therapy session, Richard raised the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "When we go back to Boston, I want you to come with us. Not as an employee, not because of any obligation, but because you've become part of our family. I know that's not a conventional arrangement. I know it raises questions about what we are to each other. But conventional stopped mattering somewhere around the time you broke into my filing cabinets and confronted me about medical reports." Sarah laughed, despite the seriousness of the conversation. "That does seem like a lifetime ago. I was so scared that day, but also so certain I was right. And I was right, which is terrifying in its own way. What if I had been wrong? What if all of this had been for nothing? But you weren't wrong. And we're here, watching Ethan become more than anyone thought possible. That matters. You matter. To him and to me. So the question is whether you want to keep being part of this complicated, messy, beautiful thing we're building." Sarah thought about her small apartment in Vermont, waiting empty. She thought about the life she had been living before coming to Boston, the quiet routine of grief and survival. She thought about Michael and what he would want for her. And she knew with certainty that her son would want her to choose life, to choose possibility, to choose the family that was forming around second chances. "Yes," she said simply. "I want to stay." The relief on Richard's face was unmistakable, and in that moment, Sarah understood that whatever was building between them was moving beyond friendship into something neither was quite ready to name, but both were willing to explore. Later that week, Ethan achieved a milestone that brought everyone to tears. During a therapy session, with minimal support from the parallel bars and none from therapists, he took 3 independent steps. They were shaky, uncertain, requiring every ounce of his concentration, but they were unassisted. For the first time in his life, Ethan walked on his own power. The celebration was immediate and joyful. Therapists who had maintained professional detachment found themselves cheering. Dr. Sullivan, a man who had seen countless success stories, wiped his eyes unashamedly. Richard swept Ethan into a careful hug, overcome with emotion he couldn't contain. And Sarah, watching from the observation area, felt her heart swell with pride for this brave child who had refused to accept limitations. But the celebration was bittersweet too. 3 steps wasn't walking. It wasn't independence. It wasn't the finish line anyone had imagined. It was progress, significant and meaningful, but it also highlighted how far they still had to go. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, and there were no guarantees about how far it would ultimately lead them. That night, the 3 of them sat together in their apartment, Ethan exhausted but happy, Richard contemplative, Sarah quietly hopeful. Outside, the Minnesota winter continued its grip on the landscape. But inside, spring was beginning to bloom in the form of possibility taking root in the space where impossibility had once lived. The journey back to Boston happened in early May, 9 months after they had first left for Rochester. The city was blooming with spring, tulips lining the public garden, the Charles River reflecting blue sky instead of winter gray. The mansion on Beacon Hill looked exactly as they had left it, but it felt like they were viewing it through different eyes that had seen transformation and refused to go back to accepting the way things had always been. Mrs. Henderson greeted them at the door, her usual stern expression softening when she saw Ethan. The boy was still in his wheelchair, but he held himself differently, with confidence that hadn't existed before. More importantly, he was wearing leg braces that allowed him to stand with minimal support, a sight that brought tears to the older woman's eyes, though she quickly blinked them away. "Welcome home, Master Ethan," she said formally, but her voice carried warmth it rarely showed. "I've prepared the sunroom as you requested. Mr. Garrett, the parallel bars and therapy equipment are installed." Richard had arranged for a comprehensive home therapy setup, working with Dr. Sullivan to ensure Ethan could continue his rehabilitation while transitioning back to daily life in Boston. A new physical therapist, recommended by Dr. Morrison, would come 3 times a week. Dr. Morrison herself would oversee Ethan's medical care, providing the continuity that was so crucial for his continued progress. Sarah's role in the household had been formalized, though it remained deliberately vague. She was listed as a family care coordinator, a title that encompassed everything from managing Ethan's therapy schedule to general household oversight. Mrs. Henderson, who had been skeptical at first, had grudgingly come to accept that Sarah had earned her place in the family, though their relationship remained professionally cordial rather than warm. The first weeks back were an adjustment. Ethan missed the intensity of the Rochester program, the daily immersion in rehabilitation, where progress was the entire focus of existence. Here, life had to be balanced with other realities. He started attending school again, a private academy that specialized in students with various needs. He had tutors to help him catch up academically. He had friends to reconnect with, though many were surprised by how much he had changed. The physical progress continued, but more slowly. Some days Ethan could walk the length of the parallel bars with minimal support. Other days his legs wouldn't cooperate, and he exhausted himself trying to replicate previous successes. The therapist emphasized that this was normal, that progress wasn't linear, that setbacks were part of the process. But it was frustrating for everyone, especially for Ethan, who wanted to maintain the momentum of Rochester. Richard returned to his company full-time, throwing himself into catching up on months of delayed decisions. His executives were relieved to have him back, though they noticed changes in him. He was less rigid, more willing to delegate, more focused on work-life balance. When meetings ran late, he left anyway, unwilling to miss dinner with Ethan and Sarah. When opportunities arose that would require extensive travel, he declined them, prioritizing his presence at home. His relationship with Sarah deepened naturally. Without dramatic declarations or sudden changes, they became partners in the truest sense, sharing responsibilities, making decisions together, supporting each other through the daily challenges of building this unconventional life. The physical aspect of their relationship emerged slowly, carefully, with full awareness of how it would affect Ethan and what it meant for all of them. It was Ethan who finally addressed it directly one evening at dinner. "So are you guys together now? Like together?" Richard and Sarah exchanged glances, both slightly embarrassed to be called out by an 8-year-old. "What makes you ask?" Richard hedged. "You hold hands sometimes. You smile at each other in a specific way. Sarah sleeps in your room now instead of the guest room." "I'm 8, not stupid." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "You're right, you're definitely not stupid. And yes, we are together. Is that okay with you?" Ethan considered the question seriously. "I miss Mom sometimes. I think about her and wonder what she would think about all of this. But I also think she would like you. She would like that you helped me. And she would want Dad to be happy. So yeah, it's okay. More than okay, actually. You guys are better together than separate." The simple acceptance broke something loose in both adults. They had been so careful, so worried about how Ethan would react, about whether it was too soon or too complicated. But children, it turned out, often saw truth more clearly than adults, unencumbered by overthinking and social conventions. That summer brought unexpected challenges. A journalist who had covered the original story published a follow-up piece, this one less sympathetic. It questioned whether the progress reported had been exaggerated, whether wealthy families were receiving preferential treatment, whether the rehabilitation facility had used Ethan's story for publicity purposes. The article included interviews with medical experts who cautioned against raising false hope for families dealing with similar conditions. The piece stung, not least because some of its critiques weren't entirely wrong. Ethan's progress had been remarkable, but limited. He could walk short distances with support, but he still used his wheelchair for most activities. His condition remained complex and challenging. The treatment he had received was expensive and time-intensive, not accessible to most families facing similar situations. Richard wanted to ignore the article, to let it fade into the noise of internet chatter. But Sarah convinced him they needed to respond, not defensively but honestly. Together, they crafted a statement that acknowledged both the progress and the limitations, that celebrated what had been achieved while being realistic about ongoing challenges. They donated a substantial sum to the Rochester facility to establish a scholarship fund for families who couldn't afford the intensive program. It wasn't enough to fix the inequities in healthcare access, but it was something. As autumn returned, bringing the anniversary of when Sarah had first arrived at the mansion, Ethan finished his painting series. The final canvas showed a figure standing at the edge of a river, 1 foot in the water, testing its depth. The figure was poised between two possibilities, the safety of shore and the unknown of crossing. It was, Sarah realized, the perfect metaphor for where they all were. "I thought about painting myself walking across," Ethan explained as they looked at it together. "But that's not true yet. I'm still at the beginning, still testing the water. But I'm going to cross that river someday, even if I have to do it slowly, even if I need help. The painting is a promise to myself." It was a Tuesday afternoon in October when the moment came that would define everything they had worked for. Ethan had been practicing in the sunroom, working through his exercises with unusual focus. Sarah was reviewing emails in the adjacent office. Richard was expected home from work in an hour. Mrs. Henderson was in the kitchen preparing dinner. Sarah heard Ethan call her name, his voice carrying a quality she couldn't quite identify. She walked into the sunroom and found him standing at one end of the parallel bars, hands resting lightly on them but not gripping. He looked at her with an expression of determined concentration. "Watch this," he said. And then, deliberately and with visible effort, Ethan walked. Not just steps, but actual walking, from one end of the parallel bars to the other, his hands barely touching the supports, his legs working in coordination that hadn't been possible before. 10 steps, then 15, then 20. He reached the end and turned around, and Sarah saw tears streaming down his face even as he smiled wider than she had ever seen. "I did it," he said. "Sarah, I did it. I walked." Sarah found herself crying too, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had just witnessed. This child who had been told walking was impossible, who had worked harder than most adults would ever have to work for anything, had just accomplished what everyone said couldn't be done. She called Richard immediately, her voice shaking as she tried to explain. He left work mid-meeting, arriving home in record time. When he entered the sunroom, Ethan repeated his performance, walking the length of the parallel bars while his father watched in astonishment. "I'm not done," Ethan said, his voice strong despite his exhaustion. "This is just the beginning. I'm going to get better. I'm going to walk without the bars. Maybe I'll need a cane. Maybe I'll always have limitations. But I'm going to walk." That evening, they celebrated quietly at home. No media announcements, no public declarations. Just the three of them, sharing a meal and acknowledging the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Mrs. Henderson joined them, her usual reserve giving way to genuine happiness for the family she had served, and somewhere along the way come to love. Richard raised his glass in a toast to second chances, to refusing to accept impossible, to the people who see what others miss, and to the courage to keep trying even when the outcome is uncertain. They clinked glasses, the sound ringing clear in the evening air. Later, after Ethan was asleep, Richard and Sarah stood in the sunroom, looking at the parallel bars that had become such a symbol of struggle and achievement. "Thank you," Richard said softly, "for seeing what I couldn't see, for fighting when I had stopped fighting, for giving us back possibility." Sarah leaned against him, comfortable in the life they had built together. "I didn't do it alone. You gave Ethan the resources and support he needed. Dr. Sullivan and his team provided the medical expertise. Mrs. Henderson maintained stability when everything else was chaos. And Ethan himself did the impossible work. We all contributed to this miracle. But you started it. You were brave enough to risk everything on a possibility that everyone else had dismissed. That took courage I'm not sure I would have had." "You would have found it," Sarah assured him. "When it mattered most, you did find it. You chose to hope, instead of protecting yourself from disappointment. That's its own kind of bravery." They stood in silence for a while, watching the moon rise over the Boston skyline. The journey wasn't over. Ethan would continue therapy, would face new challenges, would have days when his body didn't cooperate despite his determination. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, but they had proven that impossible was just another word for not yet achieved, and that sometimes the most extraordinary transformations began with the smallest observations and the willingness to believe in more. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan, Richard, and Sarah's journey has touched your hearts as deeply as it touched ours in telling it. This story reminds us that courage comes in many forms, that families are built not just by blood, but by commitment and love, and that the impossible becomes possible when we refuse to stop believing. If this story resonated with you, we have created a special playlist filled with equally inspiring narratives about perseverance, hope, and the transformative power of human connection. You can find it by clicking on the icon to your left. Please consider subscribing to our channel to join our community of listeners who believe in the power of storytelling to illuminate the complexity and beauty of life. Leave us a like if Ethan's determination inspired you, and share in the comments what this story meant to you. Did it remind you of your own journey? Has someone in your life shown similar courage? We read every comment, and your stories inspire the content we create. Every day we bring you new narratives that explore the depths of human experience, the challenges we face, and the remarkable ways we overcome them. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we look forward to sharing more stories that celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. Until next time, keep believing in possibilities,